Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call the meeting of Natural Resources to order this morning. And to start out, we'd like to ask Representative Campbell if he would open us in prayer.
Let us pray. Father, we just thank you for this day and this opportunity to be here and to do your will and to serve the people. We lift that up. We remember the Ukraine people and just pray your protection and your hand on that and bring it to a close as soon as possible. And just we just thank you for everything, and pray you be with us and guide us in this meeting and to do the right thing. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Representative Campbell. I don't know if you can amend the prayer, but I'll also say, let's remember Chairman Lynn Smith. She's at a doctor's appointment this morning, so let's keep her in our thoughts. All right, we're glad to have everybody here with us this morning. We have Representative Chairman Corbett. He's going to present a bill to us this morning, and we're going to turn it over to you, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week in subcommittee, we presented House Bill 1479, and what we're doing with this bill, we would relocate the operation and function and the revenue generated by the Georgia Board of Registration of Foresters from the Secretary of State's office to the Georgia Forestry Commission. We had a good discussion, good debate on this bill last week. It's why it was needed. I do have a sub to offer this morning. All we're doing in the sub is just changing from chairperson to director, which is the proper title of the director of the Forestry Commission. And I would like to offer that sub this morning if it would be okay with the committee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, are there any questions? Does everybody understand what Chairman Corbett's saying?
And I'll explain the changes in the sub if you'd like me to do that.
Why don't you go to the lines on that?
Okay, if you look at LC 510166S is the sub. And on line 28, where it says Director of the State Forestry Commission, in the original that said chairperson. So we just changed it to director, which is the correct title. And then on line 56, we're doing the same thing. It says chairperson in the original, and we changed it to director of the State Forestry Commission. And that's the only change. Just change, make sure it's the proper title.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it passed out of subcommittee unanimous.
Unanimous, yes.
Any questions by member of committees about the changes that Chairman just offered up? So the posture we're in, and I want to make sure I'm right on Robert Rules of Order, but since this is being changed, since this is a new sub being offered that didn't come through, I'd like to ask the members, if there's no objection, we suspend the rules so that we can vote on the new LC and the new substitute in full committee instead of having to go back to the subcommittee again. So is there any objection to suspending the rules so that we can vote on this? Hearing none. Remember, you have LC 510166S been discussed. You saw the changes. Any questions on the bill? Do I hear a motion? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I just want one question for clarification about the director of the commission. Is he a member of the board or not a member of the board?
I don't. You've got it's a 6-member board. 5 appointed by the governor, and then is the director
Is the director a member or not a member of the board?
He is not.
Not that I care. I just want it clear to the board whether he is a board member or voting member or not. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to confuse things.
I think if we go to line 20, in addition to 5 members providing subsection, the board shall consist of a 6th member who shall by appointed time 5 years from the public at large. So no, he would not be.
Okay, I
The
just-
6th member is appointed from the public at large.
Okay, good question.
Thank you for the question.
He's definitely not a member. Yeah, okay, line 58. Administrative purposes only on line 58. That's what the director is.
Okay.
How about, we've got several people online. Anybody online have a question? Okay. Any other questions? Well, do I hear a motion on the substitute of HB 1479 LC 510166S?
So move.
So move in a second. Any discussion? Anybody online? Okay, I'll call for the vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
All right, thank you. All object, say no. Bill do pass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
Members
sir.
ready?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, this is going to end. Any other business for the full committee? This will be the end of the full committee. We're going to adjourn and we're going to turn it over to Representative Chairman Tim Barr, and he will conduct his subcommittee meeting. Thank you very much. Chair of the subcommittee, Representative Barr said he'll convene in 5 minutes.
All right, committee, Resource Management Subcommittee. We have had the opportunity, this is our fourth hearing on House Bill 748. Currently, we're in a little bit of an interesting posture in that the bill sponsor is not currently here, but we have gone through this bill multiple times. And I think we're just going to go ahead and start in the interest of time with presentation. Awesome. I was just introducing you, sir. So perfect timing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I had a 7 o'clock meeting running from one to the next, and I thought I was on at 8:30, Mr. Chairman, so I apologize.
No worries.
I
No
thought y'all had
worries.
full committee at 8, and then we were doing this, so that was my understanding. But
Yes,
I'm ready
sir.
when you are, Mr. Chairman.
Awesome. If you're ready, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. And to everyone for being here this morning. I do want to, I'll begin by just saying that this is what our fourth hearing on this matter. And so I'm probably not, I think I've done the best I can to explain the measure. I think everyone here understands well the intention of this measure and certainly understands that as we try to protect private property rights, we clearly are making it very clear in this measure that we're trying to protect the marsh of this coast. And indeed, I do want to mention first that there were some suggestions at the last meeting that I want to make sure I clarify. Remember, when an individual chooses this path, and if they were to have their grant certified through this path, that land would be protected beyond that which is protected today. It was, we had some conversations about land being in trust by the people now. An individual that has a King's grant or a state grant currently has certain rights on their property. This bill encumbers their uplands, which is not necessarily the case today. And when they put it in this easement, it ensures that land is available to the public. Currently, if someone has a ownership of the marsh, they do have the right to keep people out, trespassers, et cetera, people that might be using it recreationally. So there are a great deal of measures that improve the protection of the marsh in this. But I think I've done, Mr. Chairman, the best I can. I'm not a dirt lawyer, and I have to depend on others to explain. This is a somewhat cumbersome process to understand sometimes as we talk about this title type issue. So what we have today is what we haven't had, some real experts available. And Mr. Chairman, if we can begin with Mr. Alton Brown, he's available by Zoom. He is, I'll let him explain exactly who he is, but somebody I trust, absolutely. Someone that is from my district and is a land resource consultant, is an expert in these matters. We have a couple of individuals that want to speak to this today, but I would like to begin with him on Zoom because he is actually flying out shortly and needs to be first if that is the will.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate experts as always, and especially folks that we know from our district. So we will definitely add him in. Yes, Mr. Alton Brown.
Good morning. Y'all ready for me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Alton Brown. I'm with Resource and Land Consultants. I'm an environmental consultant based in Savannah. Been in the business for 25 years. We provide a variety of consulting services associated with wetlands and threatened and endangered species, et cetera. But we also provide restoration and enhancement services as it relates to wetlands and coastal marshes. We've participated in numerous tidal restoration projects along the coast of Georgia. And so through that process, we have experienced, the challenges associated with clear title and working through those ownership issues. So what I thought I'd do is just very briefly provide kind of a summary of what I think the process would entail. And then I am available for any questions, and please interrupt if there's a specific question at the time. But what a typical project. We know that this bill is specific to conservation projects. And as I understand it, the purpose is to set out a clear path to work through an ownership issue or an ownership claim associated with coastal marshlands. And so a typical conservation project that I would see maybe taking advantage of this bill would be anything from preservation or a project that would want to enroll into a available program for restoration and enhancement. Or even just an individual who has an area that is degraded and he wants to improve that habitat, through the enhancement and restoration opportunity that is afforded. So, it's kind of a broad scope as to the opportunities that would be provided to a property owner as it relates to marsh protection and enhancement. Once an individual decides this is something I would like to do, he would request the assistance of somebody like us, excuse me, or another qualified consultant. We would evaluate the property. We would see what opportunities it had. Is it just preservation? Is it restoration or enhancement, et cetera? If that opportunity is afforded, then he could take advantage of the clear process that's outlined here, where we would submit to the state, or through their attorney would submit to the state a clear chain of title showing the grant and all of the history, and request validation. Do we agree that this individual owns this particular piece of property, which includes coastal marshlands? Depending on the response from the AG's office, they could move forward and take advantage of either a conservation easement opportunity if they felt like, I just want to ensure that this property is protected in perpetuity, and I want to make sure that happens. That ownership opportunity that the AG's office would validate would provide that extra layer of protection through establishment of an easement. Or if he wanted to enroll in a federal program for wetland restoration and enhancement, it would provide him the opportunity to do that as well. So I think, just at the basic level, having been through these types of projects and the time that is consumed and the investment, the financial investment that is required, to go through the grant validation process is quite excessive. And so I think this bill does a good job of trying to provide a reasonable process and a reasonable timeline for a response to a grant or an ownership claim. The other thing that I would point out is that, again, the purpose is for conservation. I think that's clear in the bill. And then secondly, if it is confirmed by the AG's office, my assumption is, again, I'm not an attorney, but my assumption is all the rights and privileges associated with private ownership would then be available to that individual for conservation purposes. But it is important to note that with that opportunity and all those rights and privileges, we still have a whole host of regulatory authority in association with this particular piece of property specific to Marsh and Tidal Marsh. So you would have Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. So the Corps of Engineers would regulate any activity, even conservation activities that occur in that marsh. You would have Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. You would have Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. You would still have the Coastal Marshlands Act. So I think while that ownership claim would be validated for conservation purposes, would afford the additional layering of those conservation values and permanent protection of that marsh in perpetuity, all of those other all of those other laws would still be applicable. So the opportunity to develop the marsh, let's say, which would clearly be in conflict with the bill itself, but even if someone had proposed some sort of development activity, it would clearly be regulated under those other laws, state and federal. So thank you again for the opportunity, and if I can provide any other help or answer any questions, I'm glad to.
Thank you very much. Chair, would you like to have any?
Mr. Chairman, I want to make sure that any expert that we bring here is available. So I'm just
Sure.
Or any questions, please, to all the members, please feel free to ask Mr. Brown while we have him available.
So committee, we do have somebody who's gone through this multiple times and is an expert. Do we have some questions for? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Mr. Brown, is Buddy Deloach. Would you just give us an opinion on how much marshland that can be restored, that how this bill might help that happen, where we have what was previously functioning marshland and it's been destroyed in the past by commercial activity? Could you just venture a guess on what might happen if we pass this bill? And could you also make it clear, as you understand this bill, what the only things that could happen to this land if one uses this process to establish ownership?
Sure. First, I have not completed my own calculations of what I think would qualify as property that has been disturbed in the past. I think I've heard some numbers of around 36,000 acres. I think if you look at it more broadly from a conservation perspective, and you consider if you were to go to the tax register and look at what each county would assign as private property or owned or privately owned marsh, it would be much larger than that, is my assumption. And so this bill would provide that additional layer of protection and opportunity for a conservation easement to even preserve marsh beyond what the current laws provide in terms of a regulatory type scenario. So I think it's broadly reaching from a conservation perspective. And again, I think the bill is very clear that the purpose is only for conservation. That would be the only opportunity that would be afforded through this. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. And I have one follow-up. We have some organizations that I think in many cases do good work to help us protect our environment, but some of those have chosen to put out literature and ask their members to send us emails alleging that there's something in this legislation that would roll back the protections under the Marshland Protection Act. Do you see anything in this legislation that would do that?
No, sir, I don't. And again, I don't think it limits the scope of I think it's clear in the bill itself that it in no way limits the scope of the Coastal Marshlands Act. And again, you would still be regulated under federal law in many ways. Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And obviously this bill doesn't limit the authority under those regulations either. The one thing that I just wanted to, I did not point out before, but having been through this process personally on 2 or 3 projects, I think the AG's office has always been accommodating. The State Properties Commission has always been accommodating. But nobody has clear direction on what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to respond to an individual's claim? And so I think that's what at its core, that's what this does, is it provides us a path forward, which is greatly appreciated, considering that all of the projects that we've worked on, have taken anywhere from 3 to 5 years to resolve that ownership claim. And of course, several $100,000. And all of these projects have been for conservation purposes. So.
Thank you, sir. Is there anybody on Zoom that may have a question? Members of the committee? Does not appear to be so. Anybody else? Well, thank you, Mr. Brown, for your testimony. I really appreciate that. And my question was going to be, in your experience, how long has it taken? But you just answered that in 3 to 5 years. So obviously, we understand the issue that we're trying to resolve here. And I think all of us are very concerned about the continued protection of this precious property. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to some testimony in the room. Okay. And first we have Mr. John Sibley, private citizen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Didn't expect you to call me up quite so fast with all the experts on the Zoom today. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is John Sibley. I am here today as a private citizen who loves the Georgia coast. I am a member of the state bar and have served as president of the Georgia Conservancy and as a member of the board of 100 Miles. I'd like to try to put a more human face on some of the technical issues that we've been talking about. Have you ever had a chance to take a small boat and wander way up into the marshes, back into the marshes on the coast. If you have, you know that's a magical experience. And if you haven't, I hope you will. And you can, because those marshes and those creeks are public, like a state park is public. I don't think we have any dispute here that the state holds fee simple title to our tidal marshes in trust for the beneficial use of the people of Georgia. Those are our marshes. Those are our creeks. So what happens when you throw a Crown grant into the picture? We have an answer. And a story that played out in 2006 provides an answer. Several neighbors owned land adjacent to the same marsh. And as neighbors will, they got in a fight. They were fighting over the marsh, and they specifically were fighting over a tidal creek called Sterling Creek. Now, Mr. and Ms. Black said that their title went back to a grant from the Crown, from the Crown to the Sterlings in 1761 that covered the disputed land. And they said that title to the marsh was shown by a requirement in the grant to clear and drain part of the marsh. They claimed the marshes and the creek as private property to the exclusion of their neighbors. The neighbors contended that their grant did not convey title to the marshes, and Sterling Creek was public. The neighbors won. The Georgia Supreme Court held that the disputed marshes were public. It said that to establish private ownership of marshlands, a Crown grant must include, and I quote, explicit conveyance to the bed, and that the requirement to clear and drain some of the marsh wasn't good enough. That didn't show it. The court also said that there is no presumption in favor of the landowner under a Crown grant, and in particular, there should be no assumption that the state meant to give away public lands. So Sterling Creek is public. The neighbors can use it. You could explore it. We can explore it. It's ours to use. If House Bill 748 had been available in 2006, I believe the Blacks could have won, and that Sterling Creek and its marshes would be private. If we change the law so that public marshes under grants like the Blacks are made private, we have made a fundamental and dramatic shift in the ownership of the people's marshes. Looking at just one sentence in the bill, at line 129, subsection A of 23-383, provides one example of how the Blacks might win. Under the first few words of that subsection, they would have to show the existence of a Crown grant. They had that, 1761, to the Sterlings. They could not show the explicit conveyance of the bed required by Georgia law and by the Supreme Court. But nothing in this bill requires that showing. Once that grant is shown, the sentence creates a rebuttable presumption that the state divested itself of its title to the marsh. The Supreme Court said there was no such presumption, that it would not presume that the state meant to give away public lands. But under the bill, the blacks would not need to worry about what the Supreme Court said. The presumption divests the state of title to the and I think the latest, this is the latest version of a sub, but I think it says, if I've kept up, that the presumption divests the state title to the extent provided by the grant, and the extent provided by the blacks grant would be the meets and bounds in the grant around the area of Marsh they claimed. The claim of Mr. and Ms. Black would be in good shape under House Bill 748. The bill will have impacts beyond just the creation of a better process for people who have legitimate claims to private ownership in marshlands under current law. My request to the committee is that before moving on the bill, further consideration be given to how much of the people's marshes would be converted to private ownership. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, sir.
First of all, this is this example, and to continue to pick out one line of the bill, all of that section is under special minister. So we'll have some others come on and speak to the process. But to the gentleman's comment, with the blacks or this particular case, everything, had they used this process, which by the way, would have allowed now the state to say, no, you don't have clear title. Okay, you either do or you don't. All this bill does is create, you heard Mr. Brown about we lack a real process, a consistent process that is fair to the people. They could have ruled you have it or you don't. But here's what would have happened had they had it under this measure, had they had a King's grant. Every bit of that land would have been encumbered in a conservation easement, which means it would have been public. And today that's not the case. Had the Supreme Court not ruled as they did, it would have indeed been maybe unavailable to the public in the current process. Under this bill, it all would have been encumbered in a conservation easement and therefore available to the public. And including the uplands thereof, which also today are not protected. So listen, you can continue to hear examples from people who pick out pieces and who clearly don't understand what people are dealing with today, but I had to respond to that. And let's move on. I have Mr. Ferris Cadle that I think would be helpful to the committee to hear from, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think that's, if you'd like to, would you be open to questions?
I'd absolutely be open to questions, and I have one further comment I'd like to make.
You agree with what the author of the bill said about what happens when you use this process?
Well, I do not agree that there's anything in this bill that says that lands would be public. I don't believe it's in there.
That there's a decree, Representative Deloach, in the bill, if one chooses this process. Remember, everybody has they can all go to trial. The state has long believed there should be some less burdensome process rather than go to trial for quiet title. We have that today. It simply doesn't work. All this new process, if someone were to use it, it's right here in the bill. There's a decree that goes on that title that states it is forever in perpetuity for conservation purposes. So I don't know how, it's interesting how people can really hone in on one line and they absolutely can't seem to find other lines in the measure.
All right, we have a question online. Representative Williams.
Thank you. Mr. Sibley, do conservation easements make land available to the public?
Not that I generally understand. I do not generally understand that to be the case. More particularly, I do not understand that any language in this bill says that land under conservation easements would be made public.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to move on now to Mr. Ferris on Zoom.
Mr. Ferris.
Mr. Ferris.
Thank you. I'm Ferris Cadle. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, committee members, for allowing me to speak. I live near Savannah. I have a BS degree and a master's degree. I've been researching land titles for more than 40 years. I am now mostly retired. Demand for title searches back to the grants to determine marsh and beach ownership began picking up about the year 2000. And I developed a specialty in doing that to the point that I eventually was doing it almost full time. I researched the titles to dozens of tracts of land back to the grants to determine marsh and beach ownership. And I have given depositions and served as an expert witness in court about the matter. I have a full appreciation for the essential role that marshes play in maintaining the ecological integrity and lifestyle of the coast, and do not and would not support anything that degrades their quality. I do not own any coastal property and have no personal stake in House Bill 748 beyond what the general public has. I know some of the private parties who are sponsoring this bill, but have not been engaged in any way with them about it, except for my own clarification. I've asked a few general questions. The basic Georgia law regarding marsh ownership is a basic law that prevails in most coastal states. It was derived from English common law. All land titles in Georgia, marshes and uplands, originate from a grant from the Crown, and since independence, a grant from the state. For clarity, I will state the basic rule for lands above the mean high tide mark of tidal waters, that is uplands along the coast and lands in the interior of the state. These lands presumptively belong to whoever has a deed for the property and is in possession of it. It's a little more complicated than that, but that is the essence. This means if the state decided to assert that it owns a piece of privately held land anywhere in Georgia above the mean high tide mark on the basis that the land was never granted, the burden is on the state to prove the land was never granted. I know of no case in which the state has ever made such a claim, much less prevailed for any land so privately held. It would be nearly impossible to do so, given the fact that the state would have to prove a negative, that is, prove the land was never granted. This is why, for lands above the mean high tide mark, it is rarely necessary to research the title back to the grant. For lands below the mean high tide mark of tidal waters, that is marsh, the legal presumption is the opposite. Such lands are presumed to be owned by the state. This means if a private person or entity wants to claim title to a piece of land that is below the mean high tide mark, again, that is marsh, the burden is on that private person or entity to prove there was a grant and that they derived title from that grant. If no evidence of a grant into private ownership is produced, the state owns it. Because of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act and other legal restrictions, private individuals and entities who own the fee simple title to land in Georgia beyond the mean high tide mark of tidal waters as a result of a grant for those lands can legally do 4 things with the land. One thing they can do is they can plant, cultivate, and harvest oysters and other shellfish in them. This is under the ruling in State of Georgia versus Ashmore, which was decided in 1976. This is not much of a benefit because the financial return of oyster and shellfish production is minimal to nil, so that few take advantage of it. A second thing that private fee simple title owners of marsh can do is, under a permit issued by the Coastal Marshlands Protection Committee and in conformity with strict state and federal standards, they can erect private docks, commercial marinas, and other structures or facilities, provided those facilities are water related and/or that they are a public utility. This right also exists for upland owners who own land adjacent to state-owned marshes, and therefore is not really tied to private ownership of marsh. A third thing that private fee simple owners of marsh can do is they can enjoin others from going on the marsh they own or making use of it. And the fourth thing that private fee simple owners of marsh can do is they can restore the land to its more or less natural state in accordance with state and federal guidelines in order to sell mitigation credits. Under the situation as it currently exists, a private person or entity who wishes to establish their ownership of marsh hires an attorney and gets the title researched, and they have to come up with a grant for the marsh in question, as well as show a chain of title that leads to them. Then their attorney either negotiates with the Attorney General's office or files a quiet title action. The Attorney General's office has little incentive to respond in a timely manner, and the experience has been that the state's attorneys draw the proceedings out interminably. Some of these go on for years at tremendous legal cost to both the private claimants and the taxpayers who are paying the state attorney's fees, and they're still without resolution. Many individuals and entities that probably do own marsh simply cannot afford the current expensive and drawn-out process of establishing their claim, and their rights get trampled on by the state building highways on marshes that the private individual owns, and without paying that private individual compensation, and by the state issuing permits to neighbors who build private docks across their marshes, that is in front of the marshes that they own. The sole purpose of House Bill 748 is to obligate the state's attorneys to respond to petitions for marsh ownership determination in a timely and more cost-effective fashion. The bill is not designed to in any way weaken or dilute the existing Coastal Marshlands Protection Act or confer any additional rights or title beyond those that already exist in marsh. I would not support House Bill 748 if it did. If enacted, private individuals and entities who choose to use the House Bill 748 procedure agree that an additional permanent restriction will be put on the marshes that are subject to their petition. This additional restriction is that the marsh shall be used for conservation purposes only, and that the owner can restore the marsh in accordance with state and federal guidelines that are in place so as to make it a mitigation bank. Thus the process, if used, permanently eliminates two of the rights that owners of marsh currently have. It eliminates their use for commercial oyster and shellfish production, and it eliminates their use for private docks, commercial marinas, and etc. For the public, passage of House Bill 748 will provide for the restoration of marshes that have been impaired by past human actions and provide for the permanent preservation of the marshes that are subjected to the procedure. The restoration will be paid for by the private owners of the marsh, and their compensation will be the tax benefit and the income they receive from the sale of the mitigation credits. That's all of my prepared statement. If there are questions, I will be happy to try to answer, and I will be available throughout this meeting and afterward for questions and discussion.
Very good. Thank you so much. I think I learned quite a bit in your presentation. I appreciate it. Committee, do we have questions for the presenter? Are there questions online? Representative Williams.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony, but I have a question. So I understand the bill's not a rollback of the Marsh Act, but it does seem to take land out of the public use once the land is privatized. An owner can prevent people from paddling or using their marsh, even if it is used for conservation. Is that right?
This bill does not transfer title at all, either from the state or to a private individual or from say a private individual to a state, the title to the property that is the marsh is as it is. It's either state owned or it's privately owned. And this bill does not change that. There's a very strong rule in law that's derived from English common law that tidal areas are open and subject to public right and use. As far as the old law was navigation, because back hundreds of years ago when this law evolved, the people were mainly concerned with navigation, and the rule was that anybody could use navigable water. The public could use navigable waterways, even though the bed of the river or stream or marsh was privately owned. And that's common law that has come down to the present. And so the public still has the right, for example, to paddle up in the tidal zones and within the navigable portions of tidal waters, even if it's privately owned.
So you're saying an owner can't prevent?
They can, all right, the private owner can exclude people from using the land above the low tide mark. And what has happened in so many cases, this has happened over and over. A landowner, a person owns marshfront property. Their neighbor gets a permit from the state to build a private dock. The policy is the state DNR personnel assign what's called a dock corridor. That dock has to be built in between, and these are two imaginary lines extending across the marsh. And they use what's called the principle of equitable apportionment to decide to establish the location of that dock corridor. And it's kind of a mathematical formula. The basis of it is that whatever the proportion of the frontage each landowner along an area owns at the high water mark, and they're given that same proportion at the low water mark along the length of the low water mark, and then the dock corridor is based on that. Well, if the coastline is convoluted, which it almost always is, in many cases, these dock corridors extend across the front of somebody else's property. And in so many cases, they don't care whether they own the marsh or not, but they don't want that dock, that their neighbor's dock going across the front of their property, because their interest is that pristine marsh view. And so what they want to do is enjoin that dock. Well, if the marsh is state owned, they can't do it. The neighbor has the right to do that. But if they do own that marsh, they can go to court and enjoin the dock. And that has been done several times. I've been involved in several situations where that happened. As far as paddling, I know that the public has a right of navigation in tidal waters to the high tide mark. And,
That's right. Well,
but
Okay, thank you.
all right.
Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we are going to have to go on. Mr. Kevin Lange. Is that an online presenter? Okay, Mr. Kevin, are you there?
Around, I would like to.
Mr. Lange, if you would go ahead and unmute and you could start your testimony. All right, we may have some technical difficulties there. Next on our list, Mr. Skin Edge. Thank you. Dr. Jerry Williams.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I I want to start off by saying that I guess if anyone's to blame for this bill or anyone's to receive praise for the establishment of this bill, I guess I'm the guy. I'm a 7th generation Georgian in coastal Georgia. My family's been in Chatham County continuously since 1788. This bill arose because of my having researched and seen ongoing abuses of an unclear system of property ownership rights that indeed are conveyed through Crown grants, but also governor's grants. And I'd like to explain why I felt it was important to establish a clear path for ownership for conservation use specifically. And when I had expressed my concerns to Representative Petrie and others about a lack of clear path for title establishment, I want to tell you just briefly about Arnold's Point or 7 Mile Bend on the Ogeechee River in Bryan County. And it is a property that was granted by Governor Lumpkin in 1834 for the establishment of rice to be planted. And it was granted specifically as marshland in 1834 to a gentleman named James B. Schuman. And I started my quiet title action approximately 3 years ago. And the current place where my quiet title action stands is that the state is claiming now that Governor Lumpkin didn't really have the right to grant that marsh in 1834. And 188 years of private land ownership of that property, including the plat, that was all a mistake back in 1834, and you don't really own it. But to the members of the committee, but also to the public at large, I pay taxes on this property. And if I don't pay my tax bill, it will be sold on the courthouse steps for tax sale. But even more so, the state of Georgia recognizes my private land ownership conveyed by my state and Crown grants, because I have an adjacent property that has Crown grants, by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Georgia Department of Natural Resources Law Enforcement Division will actually issue citations if someone is in the marsh, but not paddling. It was previously brought up by Representative Williams. Any kind of paddling or maritime activity like that of navigation at high tide is absolutely permitted under Georgia law now. However, if someone gets out into the marsh and they're walking in the marsh or hunting in the marsh, they're cited by Georgia Department of Natural Resources Law Enforcement Division right now, just not on my property, but any Crown granted or state granted space. So we're not in any way changing or limiting public access in any way, shape, or form. We're simply creating a meaningful path that gives the state and the private landowner boundaries on how to establish ownership of these properties specifically for conservation use. I appreciate the committee's time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. Jovially, I'm glad you're on Zoom and not in the room, because there's some high tension here. I'm kidding, of course. No, I definitely appreciate where you're coming from, and thank you for bringing the bill. May I have a question? You said currently you're on year 3 of trying to resolve this process. Is there other properties that you have had a issue with as well, and how long did that take?
No, sir. This is my first, though. I have a neighbor that went through the process for over 5 years, and he's now, I believe, after having resolved that in the permitting process, he's on year 13 right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Members of the committee, do we have questions? Online. All right. Thank you, sir. Let's try to go back to Mr. Kevin Lange, joining us via Zoom. I believe it shows on our screen that you are still on mute. Go ahead and unmute yourself there. Mr. Kevin Lange.
Okay, can members of
There
the
we
committee
go.
hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry guys, I'm sorry I'm not available via computer. I'm actually on Little Cumberland Island. I've got just enough bandwidth to be with you via mobile phone. Appreciate you guys allowing me to offer some comments to the committee this morning. The main reason that I was asked to give a few comments is I've had reason to look at a number of these titles, these coastal titles where landowners may or may not have a valid Crown grant over the course of the past year. One of the main reasons that the current process takes as long as it does with the AG's office is due to the complexity of these titles. As Mr. Keatle very well knows, it does take an awful long time to just do the initial title searches all the way back to the Crown grant, and then to pull them forward to make sure that the grant and the conditions of the grant have continued to be satisfied. In some cases, the title search alone can take months. I've recently done one for a property in Camden County that took me quite a long time, and actually wouldn't have been able to complete it without going to the state archives in Morrow and pulling the actual original plats from the state archives to match up with the deeds. It's tedious work. It is very, from a title examiner's perspective, it takes someone that knows their stuff to be able to do it correctly. It's easy to make a mistake. And there are going to be situations where there's not a clear answer. In other words, there could be a complicated condition to the grant. The language in the grant instrument itself may not be legible because of the age of the document. There are a lot of factors that can go into this that can cause the answer not to be as clear as it should be. That leads me to my main concern with proposed House Bill 748, and that is that the burden is effectively shifted at a very material part of the process. The burden is shifted from the landowner back onto the state to essentially defend the state's title. And the problem with that shift is that the complexity of these titles, that shift in the burden will absolutely positively result in property title to salt marsh that's currently owned by the state under the public trust doctrine. The result of this bill will be that there will be title that shifts to private landowners in situations where the private landowner may not have been able to prove that title had the current process held. That will be the result of this bill. I'm very confident of that. And the reason for that is the complexity of these titles and the fact that you do run into situations where the answer is not entirely clear. I understand the frustration that Representative Petrie's clients have had with the current process. We had a subcommittee hearing on this bill a few weeks ago, and my suggestion then and my suggestion now is to perhaps the focus should be on an urging resolution that's targeted to the AG's office that suggests a process where maybe there's more resources put into this particular process, or a way to speed the process up. My view is that the current process is as it should be because of the complexity of these titles. In other words, you want to make sure that the landowner has fully proven title and that the AG's office has had the time to go through that, the landowner's research and confirm that. I think that this bill is such a sea change in the way that title to salt marsh is currently handled in Georgia, that at the very least, if the thought is that this is going to move forward, you need a study committee. You need to study the impact of the bill. You need to study the extent to which this bill is going to change existing law, because it's going to have such a dramatic change on the public trust doctrine, state ownership of marshland, and I agree with Mr. Sibley that it will result in thousands of acres of salt marsh leaving the state of Georgia and ending up in fee simple title and private property owners' hands. So I was be careful in its consideration of the bill, and I think I just want to emphasize to each of the committee members the complexity of these titles and the fact that this bill shifts that burden from the landowner onto the state, which in a lot of cases is not going to have the resources or the time to be able to bear down on the details of these complicated titles and make sure they get it right. And to me, that's the biggest problem with what's being proposed. I appreciate the committee members' time this morning.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any questions for Mr. Lange? All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Chairman Petrie, would you like to close us out? I do not have any more folks either online that I know of or in the room that would like to testify. So.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. Let me just say this. Everybody's good comments today. I have tried to, from day one, it was interesting. I learned about this, I've mentioned before, as we do, as most of us do as legislators, we learn about it from our constituents, and then we start digging and learning, and had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Cadle, and I'm glad y'all got to meet him finally here today. He's wrote the book literally on these King's Grant and state grants. And so I began to learn a great deal. Earlier, one of my constituents mentioned an issue, and he mentioned an adjacent neighbor that has been dealing with this for, I think, 13 years now. That individual never could get the state to come to a conclusion. And then guess what happened? The state decided to grant them the title as long as they agreed to share the credits with them. And they did like a 40-60 split, and all of a sudden it was granted. When you see things like that, as I began to discover, it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder about the process, doesn't it? And so that's really where all this began. I do want to say this. I have tried my best to make sure, and I know that we have DNR on the line, who I just clarified with, everything in that conservation easement would be open to the public. We actually changed language in here to that fee title in order to ensure just that. So I just confirmed that with DNR, although I think Director Haymans is on the phone I would never. So, talking about growing up on the coast, I've never lived anywhere else. I grew up on an island. I was born and raised on an island, and that's where I'll die. And so I've spent my lifetime as Representative Bloach over there in the Marsh. And here's the thing. I wish, and I've said it at every committee meeting, so I don't want to not say it again today. I wish there wasn't 1 acre of land in this state that was not owned by private individuals. But that's not the case. So we can keep pretending it isn't the case. It is the case, okay? It is what it is. And so we've got to balance protecting the marsh, which we do in here. We encumber everything. We actually allude to the Marshland Protection Act of 1970. Then we've got the decree on the title. We have the language about conservation. It's clear. And so when I get frustrated is when people try to go down that path. I listened to Mr. Lange, and his comments were well made. And I appreciate that some people are going to disagree, and I respect that. I want us to debate the real issues, not issues that are just red herrings. And so there are legitimate issues that I have listened to and concerned. And by the way, I have changed this bill a multitude of times, as y'all know. And I've done so by trying to get feedback. And I will say this, I want to thank everybody who has been part of this process, every organization, every individual, because this bill today, the sub that you have before you today, is dramatically better than where we started. And I appreciate that, because I've been learning through the process as well. But what we clearly, I think that everybody agrees the process needs to be fair and consistent. I think everybody that I've talked to agrees that it is flawed now. But our goal has been and continues to be to try to find a solution to make sure that we absolutely always and forever protect the marshes of this state, and but that we also find a way to deal with, you heard DNR the other day, we have about 36,000 acres of land that's been altered by man. Okay. Now, not all of that is necessarily going to have a King's Grant, but we already have thousands of acres that are currently acknowledged King's grants, and we have thousands of others that are out there. And if someone has, if you know, it's fundamental in this country to respect private property rights. And so that's what we're trying to do here, and balance that with making sure that no matter what we do, we create a fair process, but that we never jeopardize the marsh and the environment, which is why the only way I would consider even taking up this measure was that we encumber everything. And then I've learned along the way how to make that better. And I'm glad we have made it better. And so that is the goal here. So, Mr. Chairman, so I'm certain, you know, the will of the committee, I respect and trust. And, but that is the goal. The goal is to get a fair process for how we allow individuals to choose one path or the other. And the last thing I'll say is this, because a lot of people continue to miss this. The state in this path, all they got to do is say no. You haven't proved you either, you know, we keep forgetting. It's almost like in the debate, we assume there's only a yes answer. Well, that's absurd. The state says, yep, you got it, or the state says, no, you don't. And by the way, if somebody doesn't have clear title, I don't want them to have it. I don't think any of us do. But if the question is, if they do, do they have an opportunity to, within a reasonable time with due process, to be heard? If they don't, say no, just say no. And then if they want to choose choose to go down the path of a trial, that's their right. They have that right today. But that is ultimately what we're trying to do. And so the only time I just want to clarify that, because we all know how this works up here. And so things get muddied sometimes. But I wanted to be clear, my intention is only for those that have clear title to be able to have a process to fairly prove that. I don't want anybody else. I'm not trying to prop up anybody who doesn't have. You don't have it, the state should rule you don't have it, and it remains in trust by the state. But I appreciate everyone's diligence in listening to these. Now, this fourth hearing?
Yes,
I think, Mr. Chairman.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate everybody.
Well, thank you very much. I have enjoyed
Chairman.
working on this project with you, and I think your comments here are correct in that your heart is for making sure we get this right. So thank you very much. Thank you to the folks who have presented, and for the committee in all of our hours of listening to this. I think it is definitely worth our time to make sure we get this right, and I appreciate the author's availability to all of us. So with that, we are adjourned.